So the US Treasury has announced it will temporarily ease some sanctions on Syria. The 6-month reprieve will focus on the delivery of humanitarian aid and the provision of essential services such as electricity and water. But sanctions on the government, the central bank and financial transfers, they will all remain in place. The new administration has made it a priority to push for the lifting of sanctions. Its foreign minister, who's on a tour of the Middle East to drum up support, has repeatedly said the sanctions are harming the Syrian people. The trade minister, Khalil al-Hassan, says food and fuel are running out. He says the current supply will only last a few months and Syria faces a catastrophe if sanctions are not lifted soon. And the new administration has lifted internet bans imposed by the former regime. Internet access, speed and connection were all restricted by Assad's government. The communications minister says all Syrians will now have improved access to information. Let's bring in our diplomatic editor, James Bates, who's standing by for us in Damascus. So, James, an important step, but not a wholesale lifting of sanctions.
No, certainly not yet what the new administration here in Damascus wants, which is all of those sanctions lifted. But this is an important step coming from the US because the Western sanctions are in place from the European Union and other allied Western countries too. But I think they mainly take their lead from the United States. So I think that's why this is important. And as you say, there is now an exemption for humanitarian reasons, what's called a general license issued by the US Treasury to cover the next 6 months. It will include all sorts of things that are useful for humanitarian purposes. I'm told as well it will include some energy transfers, but nothing, of course, that can be used for military or intelligence purposes. Now, what will be interesting is to see whether this is adopted wider by other important players. Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, had a phone call in recent hours with the Saudi foreign minister. Remember, the delegation from here in Damascus, the high-level delegation, has been touring the Gulf countries. It's been in Saudi, Qatar and the United Arab Emirates in recent days. And Mr. Blinken, who is on a tour and is in Asia, will be going towards the end of that tour to join President Biden, who will be having one of his last trips as president to Italy. Now, ahead of the President Biden bit of that trip, he's going to be meeting with his European counterparts, key European foreign ministers. And the subject on the table is how to help the new Syria and how to calibrate their relationship with this new administration. And I'm sure top of the list will be sanctions and aligning the other Western countries' sanctions with the US's current position.
And speaking of diplomacy, James, the Syrian foreign minister is now in Jordan and will meet with the Jordanian foreign minister later this hour.
Yes, absolutely. This is important. This is the last stage of that trip with this high-level delegation led by the foreign minister, but also the intelligence chief and the defence minister that's been in these Gulf countries, now going to a key neighbouring country, Jordan. Jordan, I think, will be very, very keen to have this visit. Jordan, a country that at the beginning of the war, almost 14 years ago, was defiantly against Assad, then rebuilt relations with the Assad regime, I think for practical reasons, because they share a border and the economic problems of Syria were seriously impacting Jordan. Jordan's economy suffering a great deal as well. And in addition to that, and part of that was the fact, of course, that so many Syrians had moved to Jordan, about 1 million refugees in Jordan. And that's why the fate of these two countries in many ways is intertwined and why these discussions that are taking place in Amman are so important.
All right, well, we'll keep a close eye on that as it progresses. At the time being, James, thank you very much. Well, a range of sanctions, mostly imposed by Western countries, are threatening the recovery of Syria's economy after nearly 14 years of civil war. Shortly after mass protests erupted against Bashar al-Assad in 2011 and the violent crackdown that followed, the US and EU imposed sanctions on Syria, followed by other countries. Later, the United States and the European Union expanded those sanctions, hitting the central bank and the energy sector. In 2019, the US passed the Caesar Act, which effectively banned states and private businesses from doing deals with Assad's government. Assad, of course, is now gone, but sanctions remain in place, including on Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, the main group that overthrew Assad and is now leading Syria's transition. So let's draw all this together. We can speak to Sultan Barakat here in the studio, a professor of public policy at Hamad Bin Khalifa University. Welcome, Sultan.
Thank you.
We have this watchful easing of sanctions, not the wholesale one that we were or the Syrian government is looking for, and hearing from James about how important that will be, but at least an important first step.
Yes, it's actually a symbolic step. What the US is doing is giving a signal to the new administration that they have faith in their ability to adjust and reform in order to govern Syria into the future. But it's not really hugely significant in terms of its direct impact. It's largely related to humanitarian assistance, which already by UN sanctions has got to go into Syria by UN decisions under Assad. There is no way to stop humanitarian assistance from going into Syria. Where it's going to make a difference is in terms of transactions, financial transaction, where the American Treasury holds the control of the SWIFT. This now will allow the Syrians to trade with certain countries, particularly, I think, Jordan, that is of concern to the United States as well in terms of its economic recovery, around certain commodities, and most likely it's going to be around energy.
SWIFT is a banking mechanism by which those transactions are enabled.
Yes, yes, because, I mean, the sanctions, there are two types, or more than two, but the two critical ones related to Syria now are the ones where you stop them from trading with your own country, and then the other one where you disrupt the financial flow. Right. The US, although it doesn't have full control of the US dollar, it has control of the SWIFT, and therefore any transaction is got to be done through New York. But also they introduce a condition that no transactions are allowed still with Russia or Iran, no matter what the goods are like, whether it's humanitarian, military, whatever, they're not allowed to deal with these two countries. So in a way, it is really just giving them the beginning of the road. And they still hold, very importantly, all the sanctions that are related to the terrorism
I want to come on to that, because there are two distinct prongs, two branches to this, aren't there? There's the sanctions on the Assad regime, which are still in place, even though that regime is now gone. And then on, as we've been hearing, on HTS, the new administration themselves, and of course they make up the bulk of the government.
Yeah, well, the relief that we heard today is related to the sanctions that were held against the Assad regime. There has been no discussions as yet, at least publicly, around the sanctions that are imposed against the leader, and not all his government members are listed. Some of them are listed, but not all. So that has not yet been lifted, and I don't think it will be lifted anytime soon, because that is much more complicated. It has to be lifted by the United Nations Security Council, and that requires an approval from Russia as well. And I think all sides, including Russia, will continue to hold this as a card to try and ensure that the new administration goes the direction they want it to go.
Right, but that's a delicate balance, isn't it? Because that needs to happen to ease the transition. But on the other hand, you need to make sure that they do go in the right direction. And so it's trying to manage that, isn't it?
Well, it's agreeing on the direction that's the issue. I think the Western countries and maybe 2 or 3 Arab countries, particularly United Arab Emirates and Egypt, are particularly concerned about an Islamic state, not in the sense that we've known the Islamic State, Daesh and so on, but in any form of political Islam governing an Arab country. They see it as a threat to their interest. And you heard that being said by the foreign minister of Germany a few days ago. I think the tour that started with Saudi Arabia and then going to United Arab Emirates and then Jordan is designed to reassure those countries that this is not the intention of the current administration. They're not here to spread political Islam beyond the boundaries of Syria. Now, I think it would be very, very difficult to avoid majority Sunni Muslim rule in Syria, having sat for more than 50 years under a minority rule of Alawites. It's going to be impossible to reverse that trend now. And the way forward is to find a formula where the majority of the population feels comfortable with it, but the international community also doesn't feel threatened that political Islam is on the spread.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tightrope, isn't it?
It is. It's going to be complicated. Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, Sultan, we'll leave it there. More to be discussed as the days go on. Thanks very much indeed,
Thank
Sultan
you.
Barakat here in the studio.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.